Okay, here's the list of representative heroes and geniuses for today. Albrecht Dürer, the greatest German artist ever, will be the star of the first half of the lecture, and he's going to work for, among others, the Emperor Maximilian I. And Maximilian's grandson, Charles V, will be his successor, and Dürer will attend his coronation in Aachen, and we'll hear about all that. Soon after his coronation, Charles V met with Martin Luther at the famous Diet of Worms to hear the latter defend himself in his own words. And we'll hear how that went, and also about what led up to this Diet, one of the most important such meetings in European history. So at the end of the last lecture, I was talking about the beginning of Albrecht Dürer's career, and in the course of those beginnings, he left the studio of his teacher Michael Wohlgemuth and spent several years traveling around before returning to Nuremberg to set up shop in 1494, when he would have been about 23. One of the artists he wanted to visit was Martin Schongauer of Colmar, then considered the most important artist in Germany. There are very few surviving paintings attributed to Schongauer, but he was primarily known for his woodcuts and engravings anyway, the most famous of which is The Temptation of St. Anthony, which you see here. This was made in 1485, before Bosch was painting his famous oddities, so it's clear that the latter was not the only artist with an interest in the bizarre, and of course you can see all sorts of devils depicted much earlier even than this in the decoration of Romanesque churches, manuscripts, and so on too. Dürer was probably more interested in learning about Schongauer's technique than about his subject matter, however. Monsters will not make up a very large part of his more Italian Renaissance-style repertoire. St. Anthony was often represented attacked by demons in this way. Bosch so represented him in a work we didn't see, and later we'll see Matthias Grunewald's famous altarpiece showing him similarly beset. The idea, in short, is that these demons represent the true nature of superficially attractive earthly pleasures. Schongauer had died before Dürer arrived in Colmar, so he went on to Basel in Switzerland, where he probably got one of his first paying jobs making woodcuts from which to print illustrations for Sebastian Brandt's Ship of Fools, about which we heard last time in connection with Bosch's picture of the same name. It's not certain Dürer did these illustrations, but most authorities seem to think it's likely, even though it's true they have little of the finesse of his later prints. He was probably in Strasbourg when he heard that his father had arranged a very good marriage for him, as these things were viewed at the time, with a girl named Agnes Fry, the daughter of a wealthy Nuremberg manufacturer of both armor and precision instruments like watches and music boxes. Dürer painted his first self-portrait, which is C now, in Strasbourg, and sent it to be shown in lieu of himself to his designated bride. He holds a thistle, which was viewed as a symbol of fidelity because it sticks to things. It seems like a better symbol for this might have been found, but in any case, the betrothal was certified, and they were married on his return to Nuremberg. As I mentioned last week, Dürer was the first great artist to do a lot of self-portraits, at least a dozen, counting the times he plays a cameo role, and he always looks very handsome. Virtually all of his self-portraits were painted before he was 40, by which time he may have thought it best to just rest on his laurels in the matter of how posterity would see him. Rembrandt, on the other hand, although he was to paint his share of vanity self-portraits in his 20s and 30s, clearly was to see himself as primarily an interesting rather than as a handsome subject. And most of the self-portraits he painted, which get into art history books, were painted after he was well past 40. Well, here's a portrait sketch by Dürer of his bride, Agnes Fry, and I think he might have picked someone else if he'd had the chance. I'm not really being fair in showing this, however. This sketch was made after they'd been married a long time. She was just 15 at the wedding and presumably cuter. It is true, however, that the marriage was apparently not a very happy one. She's rarely mentioned in his many surviving letters and such, and then only perfunctorily. She's usually regarded by his biographers as a nagging shrew who had no appreciation of her husband's genius, but geniuses are probably, as a whole, pretty difficult to live with. They had no children. Some think Durr might have been a homosexual, but it's hard to find credible evidence of any attachment beyond friendship to any other person of either sex. The bottom line seems to be that he was reconciled to his marriage, did not at least complain about his wife more than any other husband complains about his wife, and was too taken up with the creative life for romance to be important to him. It seems to say something about his relationship with his wife that within 6 months of the wedding he left for Venice on what would have been a good trip for a honeymoon, leaving his wife behind in Nuremberg. This is, in fact, a watercolor painting he made of Nuremberg from a vantage point outside the city wall on the west, looking toward the imperial castle on the hilltop in the distance, which, in this view, looks a good deal like it does today. It may be that the building at the right is the Church of St. Sebaldus, which was Durr's parish church. This is another watercolor sketch he made probably somewhere in the suburbs. Durr is in fact one of the most important artists to have done a lot of watercolors, sketches, drawings and the like, some of which we know he sold. The most important artist before Durr's day to leave behind a lot of things of this sort was Pisanello, some of whose drawings do look remarkably like Durr's, but it's thought unlikely he meant to have them treated as works of art in the full sense which he could market. In Durr's own day, Leonardo, of course, produced reams of drawings, but again, probably none were meant by Leonardo to be treated as works of art. Most are illustrations of his ideas, inventions, and various kinds of research. In addition to their importance in establishing a new medium, drawings like this by Durr are also important in the establishment of a new kind of subject matter. There were no pure landscapes not dominated by some human activity, painted in the entire Italian Renaissance. This is the cemetery of St. John now by Durr, who was eventually to be buried here. All but the most au courant connoisseurs would have been taken aback by a painting like this. They would have said the same things about it that people said about Jackson Pollock's abstractions in the 1950s. I don't get it. What's this mean? What's going on? People would have regarded looking at this as the equivalent to going to the theater and looking at a bare stage with no performance. Well, whether or not you consider Durr's watercolors works of art, they're certainly very nice. And we're going to see now several of the ones he made on his trip to Venice in 1494, and hear a justly famous piece of music, Innsbruckig Musik lassen by Heinrich Isaac, whom you may remember from last quarter because of his connection to Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence. He and Lorenzo were very good friends, collaborated on several songs, and when Lorenzo died, Isaac wrote music for his funeral. And then he went back north to work for the Emperor Maximilian, for whom he wrote this song. In fact, Maximilian himself is sometimes thought to have supplied the lyrics, and Innsbruck was one of his favorite cities, although eventually the people there came to hate him. This is just called the Pond, and it may have actually been done after his return from Venice. This is some Bavarian or Alpine subject. Somewhere else along the road, this almost looks like it could have been painted in China. The usual claim is that very few plein-air, on-location landscapes were painted before the 17th century, but these by Durr, even if only sketches, Wasserfarben, almost certainly were done right on the spot, like a tourist taking pictures with a camera. Here's Innsbruck itself now. And this is the courtyard of Maximilian's castle there. This is Trento, or Trent in northern Italy. Another view of Trent. A subject identified by Dürer only as an Italian castle. A stone quarry. Arco at the north end of Lake Garden. And 500 years later, in Venice, this is the building which today houses the main post office, but which in the 16th century was called the Fondaco dei Tedeschi. That means something like the German warehouse, but although goods were apparently stored here, it also served as a Venetian residence and meeting place for German merchants doing business in the city, and it's where Dürer stayed during his visit in 1494. It might seem odd that he chose to go to Venice, where the style of painting was very unlike the hard-edged, linear, engraved art style that he was to develop, but there was a well-worn path from Nuremberg to Venice, and he was a complete unknown and probably wanted to make use of the networking possibilities there, in addition, of course, to enjoying the exotic atmosphere of the place, which must have made him feel like he'd gone to another planet. This is a huge woodcut view of Venice made by the artist Jacopo de Barbari, whom Dürer met on this trip. The 6 blocks from which it was printed were cut, probably in Nuremberg, to which Barbari moved in 1500 to become court painter to Maximilian. Some think, in fact, that Dürer had a hand in making the woodcuts himself. The Rialto Bridge can be seen at the right center, and the Fondaco dei Tedeschi is just beyond it on the right-hand side of the Grand Canal. Dürer also met Gentili and Giovanni Bellini on this trip, and since Giorgione and Titian were working in Giovanni's studio at the time, it's also likely he met them. This is a self-portrait he painted in 1498 after his return to Nuremberg, and I think it's fair to say that in this view of himself, we see reflected his feeling, intensified if not born in Italy, that artists are men of the very highest quality, that genius confers its own order of nobility. It's a bit dangerous to generalize about this, but one can certainly make the case that the great artists of the 15th century in Italy were thought far above the class of manual laborers or craftsmen. Donatello was buried next to Cosimo de' Medici. Filippo Lippi and Michelangelo lived in the Palazzo Medici, and later in the 16th century, Raphael would be known as Il Divino, the Divine, and would be ennobled by the Emperor. This view of himself might make Dürer seem a little presumptuous as of 1498, though, because you can't sell self-portraits, and he was only just beginning his career. The same year that he painted that self-portrait, he also did, however, achieve his first big commercial success. Not with a painting, but with a set of wood block prints illustrating the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse. The subject was very likely chosen to take advantage of the concern generally felt about the approach of the year 1500. Why 1.5K, as it was called. Many thought that the Lord might just decide to round things off in a year like that, and Durer's prints depicting the events to be expected were very popular. We see in this print the four horsemen of St. John's vision in the book of Revelation. One with a bow to conquer, one with a sword to take peace, one with the empty balance, which John explains represents famine. And then he says he saw a pale horse, and he that sat on him, his name was Death, and hell followed after. And who's first into the maw of hell? A bishop. Not according to St. John, but according to Durer, who, like Bosch, whose Ship of Fools was painted just a few years earlier at the most, clearly had reservations about the worthiness of the church administration. The 15 prints in this series were among the largest Durer ever did, close to poster size at 15 inches high. Very few of Durer's actual wood blocks survive, but the New York Metropolitan Museum has this one, which was actually cut by Durer himself. Later in his career, most of the blocks used to make his prints were cut by specialized craftsmen called Formschneider, using his drawings. It's difficult to see what a print made from this block would look like, but the subject here is Samson wrestling with the lion. The easiest thing to recognize is the lion's tail at the right, and here you can see a print made from that block. Prints like these were among the first important uncommissioned works of art, and required a large investment of time for what might turn out to be small profit, if any. Artists of any importance in Durer's day almost never painted anything without a signed contract. There were few wine, cheese, and art festivals where paintings could be sold on the open market. Prints were another matter, however, and these were sold by booksellers at fairs and so on. And Durer probably made, throughout his career, far more money from his woodcuts and engravings than from his paintings. Between about 1499 and 1503, Durer painted what is usually considered his first masterpiece other than a self-portrait, the Paumgartner altarpiece, now in the Munich Altpinakothek. The imposing donors in the wings are the brothers Stephen and Lucas Paumgartner, posing as St. George and St. Eustace for reasons unknown to me. Stephen is said to have had the reputation of a rascal, and to have once been arrested for dancing with Jews on Sunday, but he did go on to become a judge himself and was a good friend of Durer's. A whole bunch of other little Paumgartners appear in the central panel at the feet of Joseph and Mary. It looks to me like Durer, in the composition of this work, was trying to show off just how well he could deal with really complex perspective problems, receding arches, building parts which are not at right angles to one another, and so on. You can probably barely make out the braying donkey, which is in Bosch's Prado Epiphany, represents unbelievers, while the cow or ox or whatever bovine animal that is pays respectful attention to the event. The ox and donkey are not in Scripture, and I don't know when they first got into the story, although the 13th century Golden Legend includes them, and by the Renaissance they'd become a standard addition to Christian tradition. In 1504, Durer painted the Adoration of the Magi, now in the Uffizi Gallery, for Frederick the Wise, the Duke and Elector of Saxony, who made his residence in Wittenberg. A few years after this was painted and displayed in Frederick's Castle Church there, the Augustinian monk and priest Martin Luther arrived to teach theology and logic at the University of Wittenberg, and he also said Mass a good many times in front of this altarpiece in the church, on the doors of which he would post his 95 Theses in 1517. Durer was himself, as we could guess from the fate of the bishop in the Four Horsemen woodcut, to become an ardent supporter of the Reformation, all of which gives this picture a certain historical as well as artistic resonance. This is one of the pictures by Dürer which is strongly reminiscent of the stony style, as Vasari called it, of Andrea Mantegna, who was one of the Italian painters and engravers Dürer admired most. It looks more like something painted with a sharp tool than a soft brush. The disrespectful donkey I mentioned in connection with the Baumgartner altarpiece can here be seen very clearly. Joseph, on the other hand, who was unusually prominent in the other work, is, for some reason, missing entirely from this epiphany. The picture is constructed in a roughly pyramidal way, but instead of putting the Virgin at the top of the pyramid, as was done in the Adorations by Botticelli and Leonardo we saw last quarter, Dürer puts himself as the most impressive Magus there, looking down his nose at the smaller gift offered by the Black Magus. And it's possible, too, that he got the idea for the Black Magus ultimately from Mantegna, because he is supposed to have painted, Mantegna that is, the first one, though the idea had spread widely by Dürer's day. We saw a Black Magus last time in Bosch's Prado Epiphany, for example. Dürer also appears as the drummer here on the shutter of the so-called Job altarpiece, which he also made for Frederick the Wise, but the rest of which is lost. This is a peculiar subject for even the shutter of an altarpiece, but apparently Job was depicted on the other shutter, being consoled for the loss of all of his stuff, and the idea is that the musicians were to try to make him feel better. In 1505, Dürer returned to Venice, in part perhaps because plague had broken out in Nuremberg, but despite that he again left his wife behind, and this time he was gone for 2 years. On his first trip, he arrived as an unknown, with little but self-confidence to recommend him. This time, 10 years later, he arrived as a man regarded as the most important artist in Germany, largely because of the work he had done for Frederick the Wise, which, in addition to the two things we've seen, also includes a portrait we'll see later, and he was to also do another altarpiece for him after his return from this trip to Venice. Taking essentially the same route as before, Dürer stopped off this time in Augsburg, where he met Jakob Fugger, probably the richest man in the empire, if not in the world, and another fellow connected with the Reformation. It was to pay back a loan from the Fugger Bank that Albrecht of Brandenburg, Archbishop of Mainz, was given permission to sell indulgences, and it was this business that led directly to Luther's condemnation of indulgences in his 95 Theses. We're going to see some more drawings and sketches by Dürer now, although these were made at various times and not as a record of this trip to Venice. And this is one of the most beautiful of all of his watercolors, the Madonna in the Rose Garden. That's Joseph at the right there, I think, getting an explanation of the virgin birth from a stork. This is a drawing of a beetle by Dürer, which sold in 1969 for $140,000, which is a pretty high price per square inch. In defending things like this as legitimate works of art, Dürer wrote that it must be noted that an artist of understanding and experience can show more of his power and art in works of small size than many another in his great work. Powerful artists alone will understand that in this strange saying I speak truth. For this reason a man may often draw something with his pen on a half sheet of paper in one day, and it shall be fuller of art and better than another's great work, whereon he has spent a whole year's careful labor. In other words, the artist, as I've often said before, makes the masterpiece, not the subject. Dürer's interest in the natural world makes one think of Leonardo da Vinci, but if anything, I think Dürer was even more interested in it as a source of subject matter for art than Leonardo, while the latter approached it more with the curiosity of the scientist. Dürer had some of the scientist in him too, however, and he made many perspective, optical, and geometrical studies, and if we can judge from this drawing, may have been the original inventor of, yes, the slinky. Several of his finest drawings, including these famous praying hands, were made as preparatory studies for one of his real masterpieces, the Heller altarpiece, which burned up in a fire in the 17th century. While we see some more of these drawings, well, here's some of the instrumental music of Ludwig Senfl, who, like Heinrich Isaac and Dürer himself, as we'll see later, worked for the Emperor Maximilian. Senfl was also a friend of Martin Luther's. This is the Head of an Apostle by Dürer, which was also a preliminary sketch for the Heller altarpiece. As was this hand. This is a picture of a copy of the Heller altarpiece, and you can see some of the parts for which we've seen preliminary drawings highlighted by arrows. This is a drapery study. The largest collection of these drawings, incidentally, is in the Albertina in Vienna. The head of an African. A tuft of grass, and one might consider this the smallest pure landscape subject ever used. The wing of a bird. A rabbit done with such precision that a window is reflected in the pupil of its eye. An owl. A bunch of violets. Peonies, I'm told. And a fir tree. In Venice on his first trip, Dürer did make some sketches, but on this second trip he painted several pictures, including this unidentified subject, and he sold several pictures which, like his prints, were uncommissioned works he brought with him. He also made a trip to Mantua in hopes of meeting the aged Mantegna, but the latter died shortly before his arrival. He did meet Giovanni Bellini again, whom he still considered, not surprisingly, the finest painter then active in Venice, although he was nearly 80. According to a famous anecdote, Bellini is supposed to have refused to believe Dürer could paint the way he did, especially hair like this with ordinary brushes, until the German put on a demonstration. The most important picture Dürer painted while he was in Venice is the large altarpiece called the Madonna with the Rose Garlands, which is now in Prague, to which the Emperor Rudolf II had it carried upright and by hand about 1600. It was painted for the German church, as it was called, of St. Bartholomew, right next to the Fondaco. Back in the 13th century, St. Dominic had advocated the use of the rosary to encourage devotion, and in 1495 a German named Jakob Sprenger had founded the Confraternity of the Rosary to further encourage its use, and the rose garlands here represent the rosary. Dominic is shown to the left of the Virgin's throne, presenting one to Sprenger himself. The baby Jesus gives one to Julius II, the Pope at the time, although Durer had never seen him, and this doesn't seem like a good likeness. The Emperor Maximilian, with his unmistakable profile, gets one from the Virgin, and at the upper right and back stands Durer, himself holding an announcement bragging that he painted the whole thing in just 6 weeks. The picture is usually said to blend the characteristics of both German and Italian art, but this kind of thing can be difficult to evaluate. It is true, however, that instead of the halo, which the Virgin usually wears in Italy, she is here getting the crown, which is much more common in the north, but she wears blue, which is more the fashion in Italian pictures. The angel musician is a common Italian feature, while the landscape looks German. Durer painted his friend Willibald Pirkheimer, the Nuremberg humanist, standing next to him, although he was not in Venice at the time. This is a sketch he made of Pirkheimer, who, like many in Nuremberg, became an ardent Protestant and was eventually to find himself at the top of the Pope's most wanted list, right below Luther. Durer's letters to him are our main source for what he did in Venice. Durer says that he'd been warned not to eat or drink with Italian painters because they would try to poison him. He says further that he tried to learn dancing, but that the lessons were so expensive it would have cost his whole income to master it. He also asked Pirkheimer about his mistresses using their code names, the Rose, the Mop, and the Dog, and he tells him not to try to take advantage of his absence and make love to his wife because he's too big and would squash her. Here's the most famous of Durer's self-portraits, now in the Munich Alte Pinakothek. If he arrived back in Nuremberg after his first trip, thinking of himself as an aristocrat, it's been suggested that now he looks like God himself, like Jesus. This portrait was actually painted before his second trip to Venice, but I do think it's true that after his second trip, even if he didn't think he was divine, his opinion of himself was at an all-time high. He certainly had the right, if anyone did, to at least consider himself divinely inspired, and in his book on human proportion, he says that if you don't have divine inspiration, if you're not gifted in the required manner, you should just try something else. And he is, of course, right about this. No one taught Michelangelo or Beethoven or Shakespeare how to produce masterpieces any more than anyone taught Michael Jordan how to play basketball or Ted Williams how to hit a baseball. Some people are simply born with abilities the rest of us don't have. No coach could have ever made me into Michael Jordan any more than he could have taught me to be 6 feet 9 inches tall. In 1509, soon after his return to Nuremberg, he bought one of the finest houses in the city. It has been extensively restored since the Second World War. It's run today as a sort of museum with a few original prints on display, but no paintings by Durer himself. He had written to Pirkheimer from Venice, complaining that in Italy he was treated as a gentleman, while in Nuremberg he was a nobody and couldn't make any money. But this is not the house of a nobody, let alone a poor nobody. He was also named a member of the Nuremberg Town Council in 1509, so he was, as it were, a prophet with some honor, at least even in his own land. This is a view of his house from the Imperial Castle on the hill above, and as I said, living here he was essentially the Emperor's next-door neighbor. Durer had no formal education, but he certainly read widely, wrote about art and the sciences related to it, perspective, geometry, and so on, as much as almost any other great artist, and regarded himself with reason as an intellectual. Pirkheimer was a frequent visitor here, as was Luther's right-hand man, Philip Melanchthon, who once observed that painting was the least of Durer's accomplishments. This is a picture of one of the rooms in the restored interior with a copy of the self-portrait we just saw. The 4 years between 1507, when he returned from Venice, and 1511 were very busy. He painted the Lost Heller altarpiece, his largest work during these years, and also the Trinity altarpiece, and these proved such a strain on him that he vowed he would never undertake again such large works, and for many years after 1511 he devoted himself almost entirely to printmaking. This is the Trinity, or All Saints altarpiece, as it is sometimes called, now in the Vienna Art History Museum. The frame you see around it is actually a copy of the original made for Dürer in Nuremberg by Veit Stoss. In about 1600 it was cut out of the frame so that it could be moved more easily off to the court of Rudolf II, whom you'll remember also acquired Dürer's Madonna of the Rose Garlands. In the German National Museum, the original frame is displayed with a copy of the painting. The whole package was commissioned from Dürer by a fellow named Matthias Landauer, who had founded a charitable institution in Nuremberg to house indigent senior citizens, and this was made for the chapel of the place. As in the Madonna with the Rose Garlands, we see Pope and Emperor, apparently Julius II and Maximilian, both with beards now. In the forefront of Christian heroes, also Landauer himself is at the left with the long hair and the fur-trimmed gray robe. At the right in this detail, you can see a fellow who looks a good deal like a young Bob Hope, but this is actually Landauer's son-in-law in fine gold armor. Over his shoulder is apparently one of the homeless beneficiaries of Landauer's charity. All of these Christian heroes are painted sort of floating above the earth in the vision Dürer has created. But one man is left alone on terra firma, Albrecht Dürer himself, showing up as he often does in another self-portrait. Well, that's where we'll take the break, after which we'll go on with Dürer's career and see his most famous engravings before we get to Martin Luther.